If one has been paying attention, the Mogu really were pathetic, and without a strong and capable leader guiding them, all they managed was rot and ruin. But why? Why did the Mogu of all Titanforged descend to such a state? Well, they had two big things going against them. The first was their inherent superiority. They were designed to be the best of the Titanforged, after all, capable of completing any task by themselves, whereas the others were designed for singular function. Sadly, this meant that without proper guidance and care, their egos bloated to ludicrous degrees, as they believed themselves inherently superior to all lesser races, and rarely put the time and effort to actually growing their skill or proficiency. Now you might say, but wait, there's other races with similar advantages, such as the Tauren, but they didn't turn into petty, warring crybabies. And you'd be right, because of the other thing going against the Mogu. They were children. Every other race, crafted or natural, had a chance via continued exposure and development to grow into a fully fledged culture and people. But the Mogu? They had no caretaker, no guidance. Ra's absence meant they were left to their own devices, and their unique system of crafting new Mogu whole cloth meant no culture could develop. They forever remained children, crudely emulating the tasks of their forebears: building, warring, forging. You might reasonably ask, why? Why had Ra abandoned them so? Well, if one remembers, Ra is the keeper we've discussed the least, the last of the 9, and totally disconnected from the events in Ulduar and Uldum. Loken had even prepared in case Ra ever showed to combat him, but Ra remained studiously silent. This is because Ra was the Prime Designate, the true leader of the Titanforged on Azeroth, and he had access to things the others didn't. Thus, Ra was aware of the fall of the Titans. To say the Titans were dead would be going a bit too far, but they were only one step away from permanent destruction. The Pantheon had, in times long past, confronted Sargeras to stop his burning crusade. But not only was Sargeras the strongest of the group, he was empowered by Fel, and he had planets worth of life to burn to empower himself further. Fel energy, you see, is fueled by life. The more you burn, the stronger you get. Sargeras absolutely destroyed the Pantheon in open combat, and they would have been slain if not for a last-ditch effort by Norgannon, the Titan of Magic. His spell sent their battered souls to Azeroth, whereupon they would reside within the protective shells of their respective keepers until they could be rebirthed, or until the keepers were damaged sufficient to force those souls to evacuate. Thus, Ra had given up all hope. This is why Ra has been so absent history's stage since the world's turn, because he simply stopped. The true sound of despair. Silence. This is why the Mogu never truly developed. Their wayward father had abandoned them to their fates, convinced that nothing mattered. It is this Ra that Lei Shen found when he descended into the Magushan vaults. Lei Shen spent weeks seeking a response from his god to no avail, and finally, in a rage, accused Ra of abandoning the Titans. This at last stirred Ra, who shared this terrible truth with Lei Shen. Ra expected this to break Lei Shen, as it had him. Ra was mistaken. Lei Shen incapacitated Ra, bound him in chains, and stole the power of both Ra and Aman'Thul. Don't misunderstand. Lei Shen was gifted, visionary even. But this is truly the core reason for his meteoric rise to power, and why it took a Titan device to bring him down in the jungles of Uldum. Empowered by even a fraction of the energy of a Titan's soul, Lei Shen was monstrous in combat, besting Loa, kings, warlords, anyone, everyone. If we discount the Forge of Origination, Lei Shen never lost a single battle. Historically speaking, this was a point in time in which there was only one troll empire, the Zandalari, and their various servitor states. The Thunder King had reached out to them and, despite the relative weakness of his organization, treated with the Zandalari as an equal. The Zandalari were no fools and recognized the power inherent in Lei Shen, and accepted him as a fellow ruler of the world's stage. They coordinated with him frequently, and, in wonderful irony, this meant they were present in Uldum at his fall. This beheaded the Zandalari Empire, allowing the Gurabashi, Amani, and Drakari to flourish in their absence. The Zandalari would never actually recover from this incident, but they would also never forget their ancient ties to the Mogu. Thus did the Zul Confederacy descend into the Mogushan vaults in search of the Engine of Nalaksha, among other things. Warned by Lorewalker Cho, the heroes charged after the trolls, slamming past the stone guard holding vigil in the outermost rows. Past him resided the spirit of Feng Shui, caretaker of the vaults cursed with its keeping. After Feng, they finally caught up with the Zandalari present. Garajal the Spirit Binder was a tremendously gifted Zandalari mystic and functional leader of the Zul Confederacy on Pandaria. The heroes presumed his defeat would blunt the trolls, but, well, you know trolls and death. For now, at least, the Confederacy was prevented from further intrusion into the vaults, but the heroes pressed onwards. Thereafter they found spirits of 4 ancient Mogu kings, still bound in servitude as defenders of the engine. Elegon, a celestial construct, was a former interface for the engine built by Ra and his Titan Forged before being repurposed by Lei Shen into a defender. It is here the heroes realized the point and purpose of the engine. Though vast and capable of much, Lei Shen had modified the device into a manufactory to mass-produce more Mogu. Heroes and Lorewalker agreed the engine would have to be shut down. Despite this failure and the reclamation of the engine, the Zul Confederacy persisted. Zul stated that all their hopes rested on Lei Shen himself. His full motives are too complex to elaborate on here, but the Titan soul Lei Shen carried was definitely at the heart of it. And, you know trolls and death. So Lei Shen was resurrected, and within days rallied all the surviving Mogu on the continent under his banner. The Isle of Thunder risen from the waves, and his Zul Confederacy allies sailed with their remaining forces to occupy. From this, both groups planned a renewed offensive, first on Pandaria, and then on the weakened Hellscream and Alliance forces. Or at least, that was the plan. The Confederacy really should have known better. Every instance when the Zandalari, in times past, directed the forces of Azeroth towards a target, that target was removed in short order. By deliberately making themselves a target, well... The forces of the Sunreaver Onslaught and the Kirin Tor Offensive, headed up by Lorthamar Theron and Jaina Proudmoore respectively, assaulted the Isle simultaneously. There was a lengthy campaign, reminiscent of the brutal fighting on the Isle of Keldanas, with each step being paid for in blood as both sides carved a path through Confederacy and Thunder elites. Meanwhile, by this point the heroes were operating independent of both Alliance and Hellscream, and worked alongside Terran Zu to perform lightning strikes into the fortress to chop off leadership and supply. Terran was gravely wounded, but the group prevailed, which is when the two sides pushed their way to the foot of the fortress itself, and thus encountered each other. Sunreaver and Kirin Tor were ready to go to blows before Terran Zu intervened, furious. To both sides he ranted and raged, how each reprisal being itself an act of aggression, every act of aggression triggering immediate reprisal. Even as he bled out, he spat at them, insisting the blood war could only stop if one side was willing to turn away. A long silence followed. It is interesting that the leaders present were both Theron and Proudmoore, as they had personal grievances with one another, which we'll discuss later, and yet both were willing to set aside those grievances and move past the cycle of revenge that the Hellscream War had been descending into. Kirin Tor, Sunreaver, and heroes united for the charge into the fortress itself, the Throne of Thunder. The majority of the outer forces were Confederacy-bound, lorded over by Jinrock the Breaker. Imbued by a fraction of Lei Shen's crackling power, he was eager to use his gifts in service to Zandalar. The war god Jalok, venerated Dinomancer of the Beast Ward, commanded many members of the Confederacy, as well as the siege direhorn Horadon. He operated at the behest of the Council of Elders, 5 leaders, each representing one of the major tribes of trolls, who operated as the chief assembly for the Confederacy as a whole. Drakari, Faraki, Amani, Gurabashi, and Zandalari, as represented by Garajal, who, true to form, was back and quite active. Garajal would empower his fellows each in turn that they might slay the heroes, a better plan than most, but sadly one that would prove inadequate. Following this, Lei Shen personally journeyed out to destroy the bridge to the Inner Sanctum, sending Sunreavers, Kirin Tor, and heroes down into the collapsed tunnels below. There they encountered Tortos, a dragon turtle warped by seeping flesh magic and merged with the very walls themselves. Past that was the even more horrifying Megara, a cloud serpent twisted by flesh shaping into a hydra, long since forgotten in the depths. An odd obstacle awaited them in the form of the matron avian Jikun, who nested within the shaft to feast on carrion and refuse discarded within. Darumu the Forgotten was an aberration, crafted by Lei Shen's shapers, designed to detect betrayal from within. Primordius was the prototype Saurok, flesh-crafted creatures built by Lei Shen's empire as a servitor race. Primordius had been left to languish in the anima, no, not that anima, for far too long, and mutated and warped in minutes rather than generations as a result. In times past, Lei Shen sought a mechanical construct to help defend his citadel, but every attempt failed until the Thunder King personally got involved, resulting in the Dark Animus, a siege golem that could increase its power by increasing its supply. The Dark Animus defended the Inner Sanctum, and with its passing, the Azerothians finally began to challenge Lei Shen's true elites. Iron Kwong is Lei Shen's personal bodyguard and trainer of his armies, skilled in mounted combat and versed in all forms of weaponcraft. Swen and Lu Lin, the twin consorts, were crafted by Lei Shen himself, for reasons uncertain, and served as the final obstacle before the Thunder King. It must be mentioned, for all the terrifying and dangerous foes the heroes had faced in their careers across 2 planets, this was the worst to date. Demon and elemental lords, keepers, old gods, all paled to Lei Shen, the most powerful Mogu ever to walk the earth, with the will and the skill to use it, personally empowered by a keeper and a Titan soul. It is likely that without the presence of both sides, as well as the heroes, this battle would have gone badly, a lesson they would not soon forget. The Slayer of Gods and Kings fell. In his dying breaths, he proclaimed confusion, claiming he had done nothing wrong. After all, he'd just done as the Titans had. In the end, like all his brethren, Lei Shen was still, at heart, a child. And with Lei Shen's defeat, the Titan soul of Aman'Thul was released into the waiting arms of Sargeras. But that is a terror for another time. Now is the time for the Hellscream War to end.